This is a good book. In The New Economics, Steve Keen methodically pulls apart the ideas underpinning neoclassical economics from a number of different angles. One of the key themes is that the linear mathematics of neoclassical ideas, like the supply and demand curves, give a false impression of our economy as naturally tending towards equilibrium, when a more accurate description and mathematics would be more like the kind of nonlinear equations that give rise to the endlessly dynamic behaviors of the strange attractor of the Lorentz equations. But in this video, I'm just going to give a high-level summary of some of the major flaws of neoclassical economics that Keen lays out. So, roughly echoing the structure of the book, we'll be looking at how money is created, modeling the complexity of the economy, the role of energy, and also a fascinating gap between the rhetoric and mathematics of neoclassical economics. But first, what motivated Keen to write this book? One of the most damning recent charges against mainstream neoclassical thinking is that it completely failed to predict the 2007 global financial crisis. The crisis and the sluggish recovery from it surprised both the economists who advise governments on economic policy and the academics who develop the theories and write the textbooks that train new economists. Not only had they expected a continuation of the boom conditions that had preceded the crisis, they in fact believed that crisis could not occur. Keen then makes comparisons with real sciences, where such a significant empirical failure would hasten a paradigm shift, as it would become untenable to ignore the gap between the dominant theory and reality. Keen's frustration is that, except for a periphery of scattered heterodox academics, the majority of mainstream economists seem determined to cling on to ideas from the neoclassical approach, despite the mounting empirical and theoretical evidence against it. And this isn't just some quaint academic dispute. The ideas of economics often underpin major political choices that have impacts on millions of people's lives, and indeed our relation to the biosphere. They shape many of the dynamics and incentives of our society. If we don't improve our understanding and thereby policies around our political economy, we have no hope of changing the perverse incentives that are driving so many parts of the meta-crisis we're facing. So I completely share Keen's agenda to find a new economics. Let's next look at some of the theoretical arguments against the dominant neoclassical paradigm. Money is a strange phenomenon. It's such an important aspect of modern life, unfortunately, and yet it seems to be so widely misunderstood. The critical misconception at the heart of neoclassical thinking about money is that we should think about it as a promissory note standing in place of a commodity, typically gold. Now, of course, this can be a useful, simple way to think about money as a first approximation, and there have been times in history in many countries where the currency has indeed been backed by or simply made of gold or silver. But it hasn't been true for dollars or pounds for over 50 years, and was often not true for many currencies in the past. Keen references the work by Professor Christine Desan, who highlights the coinage of the 8th century King Offa as a good example of a fiat currency that enabled a thriving economy without being backed by the silver the coins were made from. What gave the coin value is not the commodity it contained. The coin was valued at more than the value of the silver from which it was made, but the kingdom itself, which was carved out by the force of the coin as much as by the force of the sword. What enforced the use of the coin was both its creation by the kingdom and its requirement that taxes had to be paid in coin, where these taxes replaced a previous practice of forced appropriation. So, instead of thinking about money as a token standing in for gold, Keen and many others argue that the dependable value of a fiat currency is actually backed by the power and authority of the issuing state. And especially in today's world, where we so rarely handle actual notes or coins, money is best understood and modelled in terms of the double-entry bookkeeping of the banks who keep the records of how much money each of us actually have. Talking of modelling, another thread of the book is Keen's introduction to and use of an open-source program called Minsky, after the economist Hyman Minsky. Keene developed the program with his colleagues in order to construct dynamic models of the economy using Godley tables to do the double-entry bookkeeping of the entities in the economy. Now, while I am using the Minsky program for some of the graphics in this video, for brevity, I'm not going to go into greater detail about it or the details of the models that Keene introduces in his book. But rather, using simpler graphics, I do want to give a quick sense of how the creation of money by private banks is being conceptualized. So, the economist Wynne Godley developed the Godley tables as a way to keep track of the stocks and flows within an economy. For each entity in the economy, their stocks are their total assets, the value of things that belong to them, their liabilities, the things that they owe to other people, and then the difference between these two is known as their equity or net worth, which is the value of what they own outright after taking account of what they owe to others. And to remain consistent, assets minus liabilities minus equity must always equal 0. The flows are then the double-entry transactions that update these stocks. In our simple example here, we're going to imagine a private bank that starts off with $100 of assets as its initial equity. And at the bottom, I'm going to keep a running total of the transactions. Then imagine a client called Bill comes along and deposits $100 into his account. This adds to the assets of the bank, but also creates an equal and opposite liability for the bank in Bill's client account. It's a liability for the bank, as someday Bill may come and ask for his money back. Let's imagine they also have a second client, Jane, who initially deposits $200. Now, if Bill goes to Jane's shop and buys some goods for $20, then the transaction representing this use of money in the shop is just a debit from Bill's client account and a credit to Jane's. The total liability of the bank and the total existing money remains the same. In the modern world, this is what money and the use of money essentially is: double-entry accounting done by updating rows in the databases of banks. Coins and notes are now just rare, special cases of this double-entry accounting. Actual cash is in some sense no more complex to understand than a general gift token that everybody must accept. The significant dynamics of money are now all digital. So how do private banks actually create money? Well, imagine that Jane wants to expand her shop and so asks to borrow $1,000 from the bank. This, again, is done through double-entry updates to the bank's balance sheet. This time, there's an increase in the liability of what the bank now owes Jane of $1,000. But the bank also gains a new asset, the $1,000 interest-bearing debt that Jane now owes back to the bank. It is an asset because other banks, for example, may well be happy to buy the debt, especially if it is a good debt that will be worth more than the original $1,000 because of the additional interest that Jane will also have to pay as the cost of borrowing. But notice that in our example, if we roll back a bit before lending the money to Jane, the bank did not have $1,000 of money to lend out. It only had $400 in total assets beforehand. So it didn't reuse other people's money to lend to Jane. The bank simply created the money by updating their liability to Jane in her bank account. But this extra liability was offset by the new debt asset of the bank, so the bank's equity, its own net worth, hasn't changed. In the book, Keene points out that there's an important difference between this view of money creation by private banks and the standard narrative from neoclassical economics. The standard narrative is that private banks only create money by loaning out deposits from other clients, the loanable funds perspective that suggests that private banks only multiply up the money originally created by the central bank. Of course, there are details I'm skipping over in this simple example, such as the role of reserve ratios and the ways that the private banks link back to the central bank of the government, who actually stands behind the currency, and who also, of course, creates new money. What's important here is that the traditional economics perspective wants to see money and private banks as mere lubricants to the trade between participants in a market, a mere veil over barter. They therefore think that the private bank's macro-level impacts can mostly be abstracted away. Keene, for example, highlights this quote from Nobel laureate Paul Krugman, a very prominent and well-known economist, talking about private debt. Think of it this way. When debt is rising, it's not the economy as a whole borrowing more money. It is, rather, a case of less patient people, people who, for whatever reason, want to spend sooner than later, borrowing from more patient people. To be clear, Krugman isn't exactly a fan of neoclassical economics either. But this quote from Krugman highlights just how widespread the idea is that private banks don't really create new money and new debt through lending. They're just moving money around. In this view, only the central bank really creates new money. And this is one reason why so many economists remained relatively calm about the huge build-up of private debt just before the 2007 crash. Mainstream economists were more focused on the supposed ending of the boom and bust cycle, with ever-decreasing volatility in some key economic indicators that gave the impression of a global economy moving towards equilibrium, a trend labelled the Great Moderation. In contrast, Keane notes that rising private debt, not rising government debt, is the main indicator of an approaching crisis. Private debt, not government debt, can depress economic activity because it is too high. Keane goes on to show that with the correct modelling of private debt, it becomes clear that the creation and destruction of money by private bank lending naturally leads to unstable dynamics. Keane describes in his book a model that captures more of the non-linear impacts that private debt can have on the economy. In particular, Keane notes that in this model, while at first the size of successive recessions reduces, just like before the 2007 crash, after a while the recessions grow larger again. Even without an external exogenous shock, no equilibrium is ever reached, because the real economy behaves more like the strange attractor of the Lorentz equations. So Keane is very critical of the way that mainstream economists think about and model money, saying, for example, money is only introduced in mainstream economics when explaining inflation, which is blamed on the currency issuer creating too much money too quickly relative to the real rate of growth of the economy. Now, inflation is another whole monetary dynamic that I will make more videos about someday, but it's worth noting that Keane's views here have some significant overlap with modern monetary theory, and Keane makes a number of references to Stephanie Kelton's excellent book, The Deficit Myth, which I have already reviewed and should be linked to above. But getting back to Keane's book, another theme of his critique of neoclassical economics is not just about the type of mathematical modelling used, but also the particular simplifications that they use in order to build their models. We've already seen the loanable funds simplification for private bank lending, but I want to mention two others here that Keane talks about and that I think are particularly noteworthy. The first oversimplification is really quite amusing. Neoclassical theorists would like to derive the macro-level supply and demand curves of a market from the aggregation of the micro-level individual demand curve, the way that increases in the price of a good usually leads to a decrease in the individual's demand for that good. The difficulty with doing this kind of aggregation is that each individual has a different set of preferences on how to spend any extra income they receive. If you give $10 to a homeless person, they will spend it differently compared to giving the same $10 to a billionaire. Similarly, if the price of apples goes up because the demand for apples goes up, this will have a different impact on the income and purchasing preferences of someone whose business profits more when more apples are being sold compared to the impact on other people. But then, you can't simply aggregate all of the individual demand curves if their characteristics can vary so much. So to do the aggregation, the neoclassical theorists have traditionally made an astonishing assumption, as highlighted by this quote that Keane takes from a neoclassical textbook on microeconomics. Let us now hypothesize that there is a process, a benevolent central authority perhaps, that for any given prices P, an aggregate wealth function W redistributes wealth in order to maximize social welfare. Yeah, wealth redistribution is assumed in order to get the maths working for deriving the supply and demand curve of the neoclassical free market. The very economics that underpins the Thatcher-Reagan neoliberal politics the world has been living under for decades, and that has actually seen massive rises in income and wealth inequalities since the 1970s. It's an extraordinary gap between the political rhetoric and the underlying mathematics. And Keane obviously talks about it in more depth, and has more examples of such simplifying assumptions that on face value are absurd, and that also go against the empirical evidence of what actually happens in our economy. But there is one more of these oversimplifications that I want to mention here, which is around energy, resources, and waste. Adam Smith is seen by many as the father of economics, but Keane disagrees, arguing that it was Smith who introduced an unhelpful bias into economic thinking right from these early days, as Smith highlighted labour as the core engine of economic wealth creation in his labour theory of value, whereas earlier, pre-classical economists, the physiocrats, highlighted land and other free gifts from nature as the fundamental input to the economy. Keane suggests that this early excessive focus on labour and capital is what led on, through the generations of economists, to the neoclassical models that now downplay or misunderstand the importance of energy and other natural resources in their models of production. In contrast, Keane notes that any model of economics has to be consistent with the second law of thermodynamics. You need to use energy to do useful work, and any such use of energy can never be perfectly efficient, and so inevitably creates waste. And the ultimate source of this energy is always as a free gift from nature. Many mainstream economists have realized that energy is missing from the inputs to the models that they use, but some of the standard approaches to fix this do so by just adding energy as a separate, new input term alongside labour and capital. And Keane argues that this completely misses the point because, as Keane puts it, capital without energy is a sculpture, and labour without energy is a corpse. Which are great little phrases. So rather, Keane suggests that to improve the standard models of production, the labour and capital input terms should be made proportional to their respective usage of energy, saying energy can therefore be incorporated into the models of production simply by treating both labour and capital as means by which energy is harnessed to perform useful work. And this approach sits well with the following graph from the book, which shows how closely changes in GDP and changes in energy use are correlated. And again, with the second law of thermodynamics in mind, Keane also notes that to produce output, we must create waste. Waste can be minimized, but not completely eliminated, and it must be dumped into the biosphere, at least while production occurs only on planet Earth. Otherwise, there can be no production. This leads on to Keane referring to an interesting calculation by physicist Tom Murphy, who calculates that after 400 years of 2.3% economic growth, the amount of heat waste generated would mean that the surface of the Earth reaches boiling point. And Murray's calculation has nothing to do with the greenhouse effect and climate change. It's purely about the growth at which human economic activity is generating waste heat compared to the rate at which the Earth can radiate heat out into space. Indeed, I read a similar kind of calculation about the physical limits to the growth of resource usage, even for spacefaring civilizations, in the book What We Owe the Future by William McCaskill. In a few thousand years, there just aren't enough atoms. There really are hard physical limits to long-term continuous economic growth. Now, the idea that there are limits to growth has been known about and argued about for many decades, and Keane of course references the famous 1972 Limits to Growth report by the Club of Rome, which earlier challenged the mainstream neoclassical orthodoxy of continual growth, ignoring ecological limits and market externalities. But since then, we've had over 50 years of neoclassical business as usual, with neoliberal politics dominating much of the world's economy. And Keane discusses this history and how neoclassical economic ideas have dominated the academic world too, and how this has also led on to so many mainstream economists being so casually calm about the prospects of significant climate change in the next few decades. But while the limits to growth can be ignored in the short term, it's basic physics and ecology in the long run. And today, 2024, was, in the long run, 50 years ago. So we're getting dangerously close to, or even beyond those limits now. Which is why I totally agree with Keane that there is an urgent need for a theoretical revolution in the field of economics. Mainstream neoclassical economics has clearly failed to be a good theory of the real political economy. But it is not a trivial problem to replace it. And Keane isn't claiming to have all the answers. Rather, his book is a call to others to get involved in finding a better way of understanding and modelling our political economy, so that we can learn to live in a fairer, more sustainable, probably circular economy. And that is certainly a project that I want to be involved with where I can, and will continue to follow on this channel. And if you're interested in this kind of thing, then Keane's book is well worth a read. But have you read it already? And what did you think of his critique of neoclassical economics? And where do you think the possible solutions may lie? Please do continue the discussions in the comments below. Thank you for watching.